The sun was setting behind the oak trees as David pulled his old Honda Civic into his mother's driveway. He had just finished helping her fix a leaky faucet and organize her medicine cabinet. At 28 years old, David made it a point to visit his mom every Sunday. She lived alone in the same house where he grew up, and these weekly visits meant everything to both of them. David's phone buzzed with a text from his buddy Jake asking if he wanted to grab dinner. He quickly typed back that he was heading home and would catch up with him tomorrow. As he backed out of the driveway, he waved to Mrs. Peterson next door, who was watering her garden. She had known him since he was a kid and always asked about his job at the Veterans Center. The drive home should have taken 15 minutes through the quiet suburban streets. David knew these roads like the back of his hand. He had walked them as a child, rode his bike on them as a teenager, and now drove them as an adult. Nothing had changed much over the years. The same corner store where he used to buy candy, the same playground where he learned to throw a football, the same school zone where he now carefully watched his speed. David was the kind of driver who actually followed traffic rules. His friends sometimes joked that he drove like someone's grandfather, always using his turn signals and never speeding. Tonight was no different. As he approached Roosevelt Elementary School, he glanced at his speedometer. 23 miles per hour. The speed limit was 25 in the school zone, even though school had been out for hours. The street was empty except for a few parked cars. A couple was walking their dog on the sidewalk, and an elderly man was checking his mailbox. David turned on his radio and found a classic rock station. The familiar guitar riff of an old song filled the car as he continued down the street at his usual careful pace. That's when he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. David felt his stomach drop slightly. He had been driving for over 10 years and had only been pulled over twice, both times for minor issues that were quickly resolved. He wasn't worried about having done anything wrong, but getting stopped by police always made him a little nervous. It was a normal reaction that most people had. He pulled over to the curb near a small park and put his car in park. David turned off the radio and placed both hands on the steering wheel, where they would be clearly visible. This wasn't something he had learned from watching movies. During his time in the military, he had received training on how to interact with law enforcement safely. The key was to remain calm, be respectful, and follow instructions. David rolled down his window and waited. He could see the police officer sitting in his patrol car for a few minutes, probably running his license plate through the system. This was standard procedure, so David didn't think much of it. He used the time to make sure his driver's license and registration were easily accessible in his wallet and glove compartment. The officer finally got out of his car and walked toward David's vehicle. David noticed immediately that something felt different about this stop. The officer's posture was aggressive, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. His face showed no hint of the professional courtesy that David had experienced during his previous traffic stops. License and registration, the officer said sharply, without any greeting or explanation for the stop. Good evening. Officer, David replied politely. May I ask what I was pulled over for? The officer's eyes narrowed. I asked for your license and registration. Are you going to provide them, or are we going to have a problem? David felt a chill run down his spine. The officer's tone was unnecessarily hostile, but David remained calm. Of course, sir. I'm just reaching for my wallet and registration. He moved slowly and deliberately, announcing each action as he performed it. I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket now. He pulled out his wallet and removed his license. Now I'm opening my glove compartment to get my registration. The officer snatched the documents from David's hand without saying thank you. He examined them with exaggerated scrutiny, as if looking for something to be wrong with them. David's license was valid, his registration was current, and his insurance was up to date. Everything was in perfect order. You were speeding through a school zone, the officer finally said. David was confused. I'm sorry, officer, but I don't believe I was speeding. I was watching my speedometer carefully and I was going 23 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone. The officer's face reddened slightly. Are you calling me a liar? No, sir, not at all, David replied quickly. I'm just saying that according to my speedometer, I wasn't speeding. Perhaps there was a mistake with the radar gun. This seemed to make the officer even angrier. Step out of the vehicle now. David's heart began to beat faster. This was not how a routine traffic stop should go. He had been respectful and cooperative. Yet the situation was escalating for no apparent reason. His military training kicked in, and he began to assess the situation more carefully. The officer's name tag read Hayes. Officer Hayes appeared to be in his early 30s, about average height and build. His patrol car was positioned behind David's car with the lights still flashing. There were no other police vehicles in sight, and the street was mostly empty, except for the couple with the dog, who had stopped walking and were now watching the scene unfold from a distance. David knew he had to comply with the officer's request, even though he felt it was unnecessary. "Yes, sir," he said calmly. He turned off his car, removed the keys, and slowly opened his door. As David stepped out of his vehicle, he kept his hands visible and moved slowly. He was wearing jeans and a simple blue t-shirt. Nothing about his appearance should have been threatening or suspicious. He was clean-cut, polite, and cooperative. Officer Hayes immediately positioned himself in an aggressive stance, as if David posed some kind of threat. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," he ordered. David complied without question, though he was becoming increasingly concerned about the officer's behavior. This level of force seemed completely unnecessary for a supposed speeding violation. David had friends who were police officers, and he knew this wasn't standard procedure for a minor traffic stop. As David stood with his hands on his car, he could feel Officer Hayes staring at him intently. The evening air was cool, but David could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Not from fear, but from the stress of trying to figure out why this situation was spiraling out of control so quickly. "Where are you coming from?" Officer Hayes demanded. "I was visiting my mother, sir. She lives about 6 blocks from here on Maple Street. What were you doing there?" David found the question odd, but answered honestly. "I was helping her with some household repairs. I visit her every Sunday." Officer Hayes walked around to the front of David's car and examined it carefully, as if looking for evidence of some crime. He peered through the windows and even checked the license plate again, though he had already run it through the system. The whole situation felt surreal to David. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated like a criminal. He thought about his mother, who was probably settling in for the evening with her cup of tea and the newspaper. She had no idea that her son was standing on the side of the road being questioned by an aggressive police officer for no apparent reason. David's mind raced through possible explanations for Officer Hayes' behavior. Maybe the officer was having a bad day. Maybe there had been some kind of crime in the area, and he was being extra cautious. Maybe there was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up quickly. But deep down, David began to suspect that something else was going on. Officer Hayes seemed to be looking for a reason to escalate the situation, rather than trying to resolve it. David had encountered people like this before, both in the military and in civilian life. Some individuals seemed to enjoy exercising power over others, especially when they thought they could get away with it. As these thoughts ran through his mind, David made a decision. He would remain calm and cooperative no matter what happened. His military training had taught him that the best way to handle a hostile situation was to stay level-headed and look for opportunities to de-escalate. Getting angry or arguing would only make things worse. Little did David know that this traffic stop was about to become much more serious than he could have imagined. Officer Hayes walked back toward David with deliberate, heavy steps. The sound of his boots on the asphalt seemed louder than necessary in the quiet evening air. David remained in position with his hands on the car, trying to stay calm despite the growing tension he could feel radiating from the officer behind him. "Spread your legs wider," Hayes commanded, his voice carrying an edge that made David's skin crawl. David complied, adjusting his stance as requested. He had been through security checks before, both in the military and at airports, so he knew what to expect. But something about Officer Hayes' approach felt different, more personal, more aggressive than professional. Hayes began patting David down, but his search was rougher than necessary. His hands pressed harder than they needed to, and he seemed to be taking longer than a standard safety check would require. David bit his tongue and endured it, knowing that any complaint would likely make the situation worse. "What's this?" Hayes said, grabbing something from around David's neck. David realized the officer had found his dog tags. He had worn them every day for the past 6 years, even after leaving active duty. They were tucked under his shirt, barely visible, But Hayes had felt them during the search. Military dog tags. "Sir," David answered honestly. Hayes pulled the chain out from under David's shirt and examined the metal tags with obvious disdain. He read the information aloud in a mocking tone. "David Rodriguez, United States Army." He let the tags drop back against David's chest with a small metallic clink. "Let me guess," Hayes said with a sneer. "One of those weekend warrior types who thinks he's some kind of hero?" David felt his jaw tighten slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "I served 4 years active duty, sir." "Oh, a real tough guy then," Hayes continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I bet you think those little pieces of metal make you special, don't you?" David didn't respond. There was nothing he could say that would improve the situation. Hayes was clearly trying to provoke him, looking for any excuse to escalate things further. David had met people like this before, individuals who seemed to have a problem with military service members. He never understood it, but he had learned to recognize it. Hayes walked back to his patrol car, leaving David standing by his vehicle. David could hear him talking on his radio, though he couldn't make out the exact words. The conversation seemed longer than necessary for a simple traffic stop. David began to worry that Hayes was calling for backup, which would turn this minor incident into something much bigger. Sure enough, about 5 minutes later, David heard the sound of another patrol car approaching. The second vehicle pulled up behind Hayes's car, adding more flashing lights to the scene. David noticed that the couple walking their dog had moved closer, clearly concerned about what they were witnessing. A few more neighbors had come out of their houses to see what was happening. The second officer got out of his car and walked over to Hayes. David couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see them talking and occasionally glancing in his direction. The new officer appeared younger than Hayes, maybe mid-20s. His body language suggested he was asking questions about the situation. After a few minutes, both officers approached David. The younger officer introduced himself as Officer Chen. Unlike Hayes, Chen's demeanor was professional and calm. "Sir, we're going to need you to answer a few questions," Chen said politely. David nodded. "Of course, officer." Hayes jumped in before Chen could continue. "This guy was speeding through a school zone and then got argumentative when I pulled him over." David felt a surge of frustration. That wasn't what had happened at all. But he knew that contradicting Hayes would only make things worse. Chen seemed to sense that something wasn't quite right with Hayes's version of events. "Can you tell me where you were coming from tonight?" Chen asked David. "I was visiting my mother on Maple Street. I help her with household tasks every Sunday evening." "And where are you headed now?" "Home. I live about 10 minutes from here on Oak Avenue." Chen nodded and made a note in his small notebook. His questions were reasonable and his tone was respectful. David began to hope that Chen's presence might help calm the situation down, but Hayes wasn't finished. "I want to search his vehicle," he announced. Chen looked surprised. "For what reason?" "He's acting suspicious," Hayes replied. "Getting argumentative about a simple traffic stop. Making up stories about his speed. I think he might be hiding something." David's heart sank. He knew that Hayes didn't have legal grounds to search his car without his consent or probable cause, but he also knew that refusing might escalate the situation even further. His car was clean anyway. There was nothing in it except some work papers, a gym bag, and a bottle of water. "You're welcome to search my car," David said calmly. "I have nothing to hide." Hayes seemed almost disappointed by David's cooperation. He had clearly been hoping for resistance that would justify more aggressive action. Instead, David's calm compliance was making Hayes look unreasonable in front of his colleague. Hayes opened David's car doors and began searching through the interior. He opened the glove compartment, looked under the seats, and checked the back seat thoroughly. He even opened David's gym bag and went through its contents, pulling out workout clothes and a towel. Chen watched this display with obvious discomfort. David could tell that the younger officer was questioning his partner's actions, but wasn't sure how to intervene without causing problems. "Sir, can I ask what you do for work?" Chen asked David while Hayes continued his unnecessary search. "I work at the Regional Veteran Center," David replied. "I help other veterans navigate benefits and transition services." Chen's eyebrows raised slightly. "That must be rewarding work." "It is," David said. "A lot of guys come back from deployment and struggle with the paperwork and bureaucracy. I try to make that process easier for them." Hayes slammed the car door shut, having found nothing suspicious. His face showed clear frustration at being unable to find any evidence to justify his behavior. The search had turned up exactly what anyone would expect to find in an ordinary person's car. License is clean. Registration is current. No warrants, Chen reported after checking David's information on his mobile device. Hayes looked like he wanted to argue, but there was nothing to argue about. David had done nothing wrong, and both officers knew it. The traffic stop should have ended right there with maybe a warning about watching his speed. Even though David knew he hadn't been speeding, instead, Hayes seemed determined to find some way to continue the confrontation. He walked up close to David, invading his personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you?" Hayes said quietly, so that Chen couldn't hear clearly. David didn't respond. He kept his eyes focused straight ahead, using every bit of self-control he had learned during his military training. "I know your type," Hayes continued. "Come back from playing soldier overseas and think you deserve special treatment. Think you're better than everyone else." David's hands clenched slightly at his sides, but he managed to keep his voice level. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, officer. I just want to go home." Hayes stepped even closer. "Maybe I don't think you should go home just yet. Maybe I think you need to learn some respect for law enforcement." This was when David realized that Officer Hayes had crossed a line from unprofessional behavior into something more dangerous. The officer wasn't interested in enforcing traffic laws or maintaining public safety. He was using his badge and his authority to harass someone he had taken a personal dislike to. David had seen this kind of abuse of power before, though never directed at him personally. During his time in the service, he had witnessed officers who let their authority go to their heads. Most military personnel were professional and honorable, but there were always a few who couldn't handle the responsibility that came with their position. Hayes was clearly one of those people. He had decided that David represented something he didn't like, and he was going to use his position as a police officer to make David's evening as difficult as possible. Chen seemed to be growing more uncomfortable with his partner's behavior. He kept glancing between Hayes and David, clearly sensing that the situation was getting out of hand. But as the junior officer, he was probably reluctant to directly challenge his partner's actions. David found himself in a difficult position. He could continue to be cooperative and hope that the situation would eventually de-escalate. Or he could assert his rights and demand that the officers either charge him with something or let him go. Both options carried risks. If he remained passive, Hayes might continue to push boundaries until something serious happened. But if he became more assertive, Hayes might use that as an excuse to escalate the situation even further. David decided to try a middle approach. He would remain respectful but start asking direct questions about what was happening and why. "Officer Hayes," David said carefully, "I've been cooperative throughout this stop. I've answered all your questions and allowed you to search my vehicle. Can you please tell me what I'm being detained for?" Hayes's eyes flashed with anger at being questioned. "You're being detained because I say you're being detained. But on what legal grounds?" David pressed gently. This question seemed to catch Hayes off guard. He clearly hadn't expected David to know enough about his rights to ask direct questions. Chen was also paying close attention now, probably wondering the same thing. Hayes looked around as if searching for an answer. The street was quiet except for the small group of neighbors who had gathered to watch the incident unfold. David noticed that one of them was holding up a cell phone, possibly recording the interaction. The presence of witnesses seemed to make Hayes even more agitated. He was probably beginning to realize that his behavior was being observed and possibly documented. But instead of calming down, he seemed to be getting more desperate to justify his actions. That's when Hayes made a decision that would change everything. Instead of admitting that he had overreacted and ending the traffic stop, he decided to double down on his aggressive approach, and that decision was about to turn a simple traffic stop into something much more dangerous. Hayes stepped back from David and unclipped his radio from his shoulder. His voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear as he spoke into the device. "This is Unit 47, requesting additional backup at the corner of Roosevelt and Pine. I have a suspect who is being uncooperative and potentially dangerous." David felt his blood run cold. Hayes was completely misrepresenting the situation, and David knew that every word was being recorded and would become part of the official record. The neighbors watching from across the street began talking among themselves, clearly confused by what they were witnessing. Chen looked shocked. "What dangerous behavior?" he asked his partner quietly. Hayes ignored the question and continued speaking into his radio. "Suspect is a male, approximately 6 feet tall, appears to be under the influence or mentally unstable. Requesting immediate backup." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. None of those descriptions were accurate. He was completely sober, mentally stable, and had been nothing but cooperative throughout the entire encounter. Hayes was creating a false narrative that could be used to justify whatever happened next. "Officer Hayes," David said carefully, "I haven't done anything dangerous or uncooperative. You can ask Officer Chen. I've followed every instruction you've given me." "Shut up," Hayes snapped. "Don't talk unless I tell you to talk." Chen stepped forward slightly. "Hayes, maybe we should just issue a warning and wrap this up. There's no evidence of any real violation here." Hayes whirled around to face his partner. "Are you questioning my judgment? I know what I saw. This guy was speeding and now he's acting erratic." David realized that Hayes was not only lying about him, but he was also putting Chen in an impossible position. The younger officer clearly knew that Hayes was overreacting, but challenging a senior officer in front of civilians could create serious problems for his career. The sound of additional sirens filled the air. David's heart sank as he realized that more police cars were approaching. What had started as a simple traffic stop was now becoming a major incident involving multiple officers. The situation was spiraling completely out of control. 2 more patrol cars arrived within minutes. 4 additional officers got out and approached the scene. David noticed that some of them looked confused about why they had been called to what appeared to be a routine traffic stop. Hayes immediately took charge of briefing the new arrivals. This suspect was speeding through a school zone and became hostile when stopped. He's been argumentative, and I believe he may be impaired or having some kind of mental health episode. David listened in disbelief as Hayes continued to fabricate details that had never happened. According to Hayes's version of events, David had refused to provide identification, had made threatening gestures, and had acted in a way that suggested he might be dangerous. One of the newly arrived officers, a sergeant based on his stripes, looked around the scene with experienced eyes. He noticed David standing calmly by his car with his hands visible, clearly not acting in any way that would suggest mental instability or aggression. "What exactly has the suspect done that's threatening?" the sergeant asked Hayes. Hayes seemed flustered by the direct question. He's been argumentative, questioning my authority, making demands about legal grounds and that kind of thing." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "So he asked questions about why he was being detained?" "It wasn't just questions," Hayes insisted. "It was his whole attitude, his body language, the way he was looking at me." David could see that the sergeant was not impressed with Hayes's explanations. Other officers were also beginning to look skeptical. David's calm demeanor and cooperative behavior were clearly not matching the description they had been given over the radio. But Hayes wasn't finished. In what would later be described as a moment of extremely poor judgment, he decided to escalate the situation even further. "I think he might be reaching for something," Hayes announced loudly. This was completely false. David's hands were clearly visible at his sides, and he had not made any sudden movements. But the moment Hayes said those words, the entire dynamic of the scene changed. Several officers immediately became more alert, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. David felt a chill of fear run through his body as he realized how dangerous this had become. "Sir, I need you to put your hands up right now," the sergeant commanded. David immediately raised his hands above his head. "My hands are up. I haven't reached for anything." Hayes drew his service weapon and pointed it in David's direction. "Get down on the ground, now!" David's military training kicked in automatically. In combat situations, he had learned to stay calm under pressure and assess threats quickly. But this was different. This was supposed to be a routine interaction with law enforcement in his own hometown. "I'm going to comply with your instructions," David said in a clear, steady voice. "I'm getting down on the ground now." David slowly lowered himself to his knees, then laid down on the asphalt with his hands stretched out in front of him. The pavement was rough against his face, and he could smell motor oil and dust from the street. Hayes kept his weapon drawn while other officers approached David. Chen looked deeply uncomfortable with how the situation had developed, but he was now caught up in the momentum of events. "Don't move," Hayes shouted. even though David was already lying motionless on the ground. Then Hayes made another command that created confusion. Roll over onto your back. David was now faced with contradictory orders. Hayes had just told him not to move, but was now commanding him to roll over. This kind of conflicting instruction was extremely dangerous because it made it impossible for David to comply with both orders simultaneously. David had read about situations like this before. Sometimes officers would give contradictory commands deliberately, creating a scenario where any action by the suspect could be interpreted as non-compliance. David realized he was in serious danger. "Officer, you just told me not to move, but now you're telling me to roll over," David said calmly. "Can you please clarify which instruction you want me to follow?" This reasonable question seemed to enrage Hayes even more. "Stop talking back to me. Just do what I tell you." The sergeant stepped forward. "Hayes, let me handle this," he addressed David directly. "Sir, I want you to slowly roll onto your back, keeping your hands visible at all times." David carefully followed the sergeant's instruction, moving slowly and deliberately. As he rolled over, he could see Hayes still pointing his weapon at him, his face red with anger and adrenaline. Other officers were beginning to position themselves around David, creating a circle of law enforcement personnel. From David's position on the ground, looking up at all these armed officers, the situation felt surreal and terrifying. One of the officers began to approach David to handcuff him, but the sergeant held up a hand to stop him. "Hold on. What exactly are we arresting him for?" This question hung in the air for several seconds. Hayes looked around at his colleagues, clearly struggling to come up with a specific charge that would justify the level of force being used. "Resisting arrest?" Hayes finally said. "But what was he originally being arrested for?" the sergeant pressed. Hayes's face grew even redder. "Speeding. And then resisting when I tried to detain him." David could see that several of the officers were looking skeptical. His behavior throughout the encounter had been completely cooperative, and there was no evidence of resistance that would justify drawing weapons. Chen finally spoke up. "Sergeant, the suspect has been cooperative throughout the entire stop. He provided his license and registration immediately, allowed a vehicle search, and has followed all instructions." Hayes shot Chen a look of pure anger. "Whose side are you on?" The sergeant ignored Hayes's outburst and knelt down next to David. "Sir, what's your name?" "David Rodriguez," David replied calmly. "Mr. Rodriguez, have you been drinking or using any drugs tonight?" "No, sir. I don't drink or use drugs." The sergeant could see that David's eyes were clear, his speech was normal, and his behavior was rational. There were no signs of impairment or mental instability. "What do you do for work, Mr. Rodriguez?" "I work at the Regional Veterans Center helping other veterans with benefits and transition services." The sergeant's eyebrows raised slightly. "Are you a veteran yourself?" "Yes, sir. I served 4 years in the Army." "What was your role in the Army?" David hesitated for a moment. He generally didn't like to discuss the specifics of his military service, especially his deployments and training. But he realized that this might be important information given the current situation. "I was in Special Forces, sir. I served 3 tours overseas." This information changed the atmosphere of the scene dramatically. Several officers exchanged glances, and David could see that they were beginning to reassess the situation. A decorated Special Forces veteran working at a veterans center was not the profile of someone who would pose a threat during a routine traffic stop. Hayes, however, seemed only more agitated by this revelation. "I don't care what he claims he did in the military. He's a threat now and needs to be treated as such." The sergeant stood up and walked over to Hayes. David couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see that the sergeant was speaking firmly to the other officer. Hayes's weapon was still drawn, but he was no longer pointing it directly at David. From his position on the ground, David could see neighbors watching from windows and doorways. Some were holding cell phones, clearly recording the incident. David was grateful for their presence, knowing that these recordings might be crucial in documenting what had really happened. One of the older officers approached the sergeant and spoke quietly to him. David caught fragments of their conversation, including the words excessive force and internal affairs. David realized that the other officers were beginning to understand that Hayes had created a dangerous situation without proper justification. But he also knew that he was still lying on the ground with multiple weapons potentially pointed at him. and the situation could still go very wrong very quickly. The evening air was getting cooler, and David could feel the rough asphalt against his cheek. His military training had taught him patience and discipline, but lying on the ground while being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood was one of the most humiliating experiences of his life. But David also knew that this moment would be crucial in determining how the rest of the incident would unfold. If he remained calm and continued to demonstrate that he posed no threat, the more reasonable officers might be able to regain control of the situation. However, Hayes still had his weapon drawn, and David could tell that the officer was looking for any excuse to justify his aggressive behavior. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, and this routine traffic stop could turn into something tragic. David closed his eyes for a moment and thought about his mother, probably wondering why he was taking so long to get home. He thought about the veterans he worked with every day, many of whom had faced far more dangerous situations than this. And he thought about the training that had prepared him to stay calm under pressure, even when everything seemed to be falling apart around him. David took a deep breath while lying on the asphalt. The situation had gotten completely out of hand, and he knew that someone needed to take control before it got worse. The sergeant seemed like a reasonable person, and David decided it was time to provide more information about who he was. "Sergeant," David said calmly, "I'd like to provide you with some additional information that might help clarify this situation." The sergeant looked down at him. "Go ahead, Mr. Rodriguez. My full name is David Anthony Rodriguez. I served in the United States Army from 2018 to 2022. I was with the 75th Ranger Regiment before being selected for Special Forces training. I completed 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan." David paused, making sure he had the sergeant's attention. "I was awarded the Bronze Star Medal with Valor Device for actions during my 2nd deployment. And I received the Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device during my 3rd tour." The sergeant's expression changed noticeably. These were not the kind of decorations that were given out lightly. They were earned through exceptional courage and performance under fire. Hayes scoffed. "Anyone can claim they have medals. That doesn't prove anything." David remained calm. "You can verify everything I'm telling you. My service record is documented, and I can provide references who will vouch for my character and service." The sergeant knelt back down next to David. "Who would you suggest we contact to verify this information?" "You can contact Command Sergeant Major William Thompson at the Regional Veterans Center. He was my commanding officer during my 1st deployment. He's now the Director of Veteran Services for the county." David continued. "You can also contact Captain Rebecca Martinez, who is now a civilian working for the Department of Veterans Affairs. She served with me during all 3 deployments and can verify my service record." The sergeant made notes of these names. "Anyone else?" "Colonel James Patterson, retired, who lives here locally. He was my commanding officer during Special Forces training. He's now a member of the City Council." Hayes looked uncomfortable as David provided specific names and details that could be easily verified. "This is all just talk. Anyone can make up names and stories." But David wasn't finished. "Sergeant, if you'd like to verify my identity and service record immediately, you can contact the Veterans Administration database. My VA file number is TX28479156. That will show you my complete service record, including deployment dates, unit assignments, and decorations." The sergeant stood up and walked away to make a phone call. David could see him speaking into his radio, presumably requesting someone to verify the information he had provided. While they waited, David addressed the other officers who were still standing around him. "I want you all to know that I have the utmost respect for law enforcement. I work with police officers regularly in my job at the Veterans Center. We collaborate on programs to help veterans who are struggling with PTSD and other issues." One of the younger officers looked curious. "What kind of programs?" "We run support groups for veterans who are having trouble adjusting to civilian life. Sometimes that includes veterans who have had negative encounters with law enforcement due to PTSD episodes or substance abuse issues. We work with local police to train them on how to recognize and respond to veterans in crisis." Chen, who had been quiet during most of the recent exchange, stepped forward. "That sounds like important work." "It is," David replied. "A lot of veterans come home and struggle with the transition. They serve their country honorably, but they need support to successfully reintegrate into civilian society." Hayes seemed increasingly agitated as David spoke. The more David revealed about his background and work, the more unreasonable Hayes's behavior appeared. The sergeant returned from his phone call with a notably different demeanor. "Mr. Rodriguez, I've just spoken with the duty officer at the Veterans Center. Command Sergeant Major Thompson confirms your identity and service record. He also wanted me to know that you received the Purple Heart for wounds sustained during your second deployment." David had not mentioned the Purple Heart himself. It was not something he talked about because it represented one of the worst days of his military service, when his unit had been ambushed and several of his friends had been killed. "Thank you for verifying that information, sir," David said quietly. The sergeant continued, "CSM Thompson also informed me that you've been instrumental in developing the crisis intervention program that several local police departments now use when dealing with veterans in distress." This revelation clearly surprised several of the officers. They were now learning that the man they had surrounded with drawn weapons was actually someone who had dedicated his civilian career to helping both veterans and law enforcement. Hayes, however, was not giving up. "I don't care what he did in the past. Right now he was speeding and then became uncooperative during a traffic stop." The sergeant turned to Hayes with a stern expression. "Officer Hayes, can you show me the radar reading that indicates Mr. Rodriguez was speeding?" Hayes hesitated. I observed him speeding with my own eyes." "But do you have any electronic evidence of the violation?" Hayes looked uncomfortable. The radar gun was malfunctioning earlier today. This was news to Chen, who looked surprised. "You didn't mention that the radar wasn't working." The sergeant made a note. "So there's no actual evidence of a speeding violation?" Hayes's face was getting redder. "I know what I saw." David decided to provide one more piece of information. "Sergeant, if you check with dispatch, you'll find that I called the non-emergency line about 2 weeks ago to report a pothole on this same street. I drive through here every Sunday to visit my mother, and I've always been careful about the speed limit, because I know this is a residential area with a school." The sergeant radioed dispatch and confirmed that there was indeed a record of David calling to report road maintenance issues in the neighborhood. By now, it was becoming clear to everyone except Hayes that this entire incident had been unnecessary. David had done nothing wrong, and his background suggested that he was exactly the kind of person who would be careful to follow traffic laws and cooperate with police. One of the officers approached the sergeant and spoke quietly to him. David couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see that it was serious. The sergeant then walked over to Hayes and had a longer, more intense conversation with him. David could hear fragments of it, including phrases like excessive force and false statements and immediate supervisor. Hayes looked like he was arguing, but the sergeant's body language indicated that the conversation was not going well for him. Meanwhile, Chen approached David, who was still lying on the ground. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want to apologize for how this situation has developed. This is not how a routine traffic stop should be handled." "I appreciate that, Officer Chen. I understand that you were put in a difficult position." Chen looked around to make sure Hayes couldn't hear him clearly. "I've been partnered with Hayes for about 6 months, and I've seen him escalate situations that didn't need to be escalated. But I've never seen anything like this," David nodded. "I hope this can be a learning experience for everyone involved." The sergeant returned and knelt down next to David again. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm going to ask you to slowly sit up, keeping your hands visible." David carefully followed the instruction, grateful to finally be getting off the rough pavement. As he sat up, he could see that Hayes had holstered his weapon but still looked angry and defensive. "Mr. Rodriguez," the sergeant continued, "based on my investigation of this incident, I don't see any evidence that you committed a traffic violation or engaged in any behavior that would justify the level of response you've experienced tonight." David felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, Sergeant. However, I want to make sure I have a complete understanding of the situation." "Is there anything else you think I should know?" David thought for a moment. "Just that I hope this incident can be used constructively. I've worked with a lot of police officers, and the vast majority of them are professional, dedicated public servants. Tonight's events don't change my opinion of law enforcement overall." The sergeant seemed impressed by David's mature response. "That's a very professional attitude, sir." David stood up slowly, brushing dust and debris from his clothes. His knees were scraped from the asphalt and his shirt was torn, but he was otherwise unhurt. "What happens now?" David asked. The sergeant looked over at Hayes, then back at David. "Mr. Rodriguez, you're free to go. There will be a full investigation of this incident, and I'll be filing a detailed report about everything that happened here tonight." David nodded. "I'm willing to cooperate with any investigation. I appreciate that. Someone from our Internal Affairs Department will probably want to speak with you in the next few days." David picked up his keys from where they had fallen when he was ordered to the ground. His car was still parked where he had originally stopped, and it appeared undamaged. As David walked toward his vehicle, several of the officers approached him to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Their behavior was a stark contrast to how the evening had begun. Chen was among those who approached him. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to know that I'll be providing a complete and accurate account of everything I witnessed tonight." "Thank you. Officer Chen, I know that couldn't have been easy for you." Hayes remained standing by his patrol car, still looking angry but no longer actively involved in the interaction. As David got into his car, the sergeant approached his window. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced tonight. This is not representative of how this department operates, and we will make sure it doesn't happen again." David started his car and rolled down his window. "Sergeant, I appreciate your professionalism in handling this situation. It could have ended very differently if you hadn't been here." The sergeant nodded grimly. "That's exactly what worries me." As David drove away, he could see in his rearview mirror that the sergeant was having another serious conversation with Hayes. He suspected it would be the last conversation Hayes would have as a police officer, at least in this jurisdiction. David's phone buzzed with a text from his mother asking if he was okay because he was taking longer than usual to get home. He smiled slightly and texted back that he was fine and would call her when he got to his apartment. As he drove through the quiet streets toward home, David reflected on what had just happened. It had been one of the most dangerous and stressful experiences of his civilian life, but he was proud of how he had handled it. His military training had prepared him to stay calm under pressure, and that training had possibly saved his life tonight. But David also knew that not everyone would have been as fortunate as he was. If he hadn't been a decorated veteran with verifiable references and a respected position in the community, the outcome might have been very different. That realization would stay with him for a long time. David arrived at his apartment complex 45 minutes later than usual. He sat in his car for a few moments, still processing what had happened. His hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline that was finally wearing off. The scraped knees and torn shirt were physical reminders of how close the situation had come to disaster. His phone rang. It was his mother. "David, honey, are you all right? You usually call by now to let me know you made it home safely." David took a deep breath, trying to decide how much to tell her. "I'm fine, Mom. I just had an unexpected delay on the way home." "What kind of delay? Car trouble?" "No, nothing like that. I'll tell you about it tomorrow when I visit. It's nothing for you to worry about." After hanging up, David went upstairs to his apartment and sat down at his kitchen table. He made himself a cup of tea and tried to make sense of what had just occurred. In his 4 years of military service, including 3 combat deployments, he had never felt as threatened as he had during those 20 minutes on the side of the road. 2 days later, David received a phone call from Detective Sarah Williams from the police department's Internal Affairs Division. She asked if he would be willing to meet with her to discuss the incident. David agreed and scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. Detective Williams met David at the Veterans Center, in a conference room that David often used for counseling sessions with other veterans. She was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about every aspect of the traffic stop. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to know that we take allegations of police misconduct very seriously," Detective Williams said. "Your case has been assigned the highest priority for investigation." David provided a complete account of the evening, from the initial traffic stop through his eventual release. Detective Williams took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions about specific aspects of Officer Hayes' behavior. The dash camera and body camera footage from all the officers involved has been secured and reviewed, Detective Williams explained. "The footage supports your account of the events completely." She paused and looked at David seriously. "Mr. Rodriguez, I have to tell you that what happened to you was completely unacceptable. Officer Hayes violated multiple department policies and potentially several laws." David nodded. "I appreciate the investigation, but I want to make sure this is about more than just punishment. I'd like to see this turned into something positive. Detective Williams looked interested. What do you mean? I work with veterans who have had negative encounters with law enforcement. Sometimes those encounters happen because officers aren't trained to recognize PTSD symptoms or other issues that veterans face. But sometimes they happen because of officers like Hayes who let their authority go to their heads. David continued. Instead of just disciplining Hayes, maybe this could be an opportunity to improve training for all officers. Help them understand how to de-escalate situations instead of escalating them. Detective Williams smiled. That's a very constructive approach. Are you interested in being involved in developing that kind of training? Absolutely. 3 weeks later, David received another phone call, this time from Police Chief Robert Martinez. The chief asked if David would be willing to meet with him and several other department leaders to discuss the incident and David's suggestions for improved training. The meeting took place at police headquarters in a conference room filled with senior officers, training supervisors, and civilian oversight personnel. David was impressed by how seriously they were taking his suggestions. Chief Martinez opened the meeting by addressing David directly. Mr. Rodriguez, first I want to personally apologize for what you experienced. Officer Hayes' behavior was completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of this department. The chief continued. Officer Hayes has been terminated from the police force. He will not be eligible for rehire by this department or any other law enforcement agency in the state. David felt a mixture of relief and sadness at this news. He was glad that Hayes would not be in a position to threaten other civilians, but he also felt sorry for anyone whose career was ended in such a way. However, Chief Martinez continued, we want to do more than just address this one incident. We want to make sure it never happens again. That's why we've asked you here today. Over the next 2 hours, David worked with the police leadership to develop a comprehensive training program focused on de-escalation techniques, recognizing signs of PTSD in veterans, and understanding how military training might affect a person's behavior during police encounters. One thing I learned during my service, David explained, is that military personnel are trained to follow orders quickly and completely. When you give contradictory orders to a veteran, it creates confusion and stress that can be misinterpreted as resistance or aggression. Training Supervisor Lieutenant Johnson took notes. That's an excellent point. How would you suggest we address that in our training? Teach officers to give clear, specific instructions one at a time, David replied. If you need to change the instruction, acknowledge that you're changing it and explain why. David also suggested that officers receive training on how to recognize the signs of combat stress and PTSD. A veteran who seems nervous or hypervigilant during a traffic stop might not be planning to resist arrest. They might just be experiencing anxiety related to their service experiences. The meeting resulted in a commitment from the police department to implement a new training curriculum within 6 months. David agreed to help develop the materials and to serve as an instructor for some of the sessions. News of the incident and David's constructive response began to spread through the veteran community. David received calls from veterans in other cities who had experienced